Hey, welcome. Today we're diving into a huge concept, one that's pretty much the foundation of modern democracy, constitutionalism. And trust me, it's about way more than just a piece of paper. It's really about the big idea of how we control power so we can protect our freedom. So, let's jump right in.
So, to really get what constitutionalism is all about, you've got to start with the problem it's trying to solve. And that problem, when you get right down to it, is power. I mean, history is just one long story of what happens when power gets out of control.
You know, Lord Acton just hit the nail on the head with this one. It's this universal truth about people and government. The more power you give someone or some group, the more likely it is they're going to misuse it. It's a challenge that's as old as time.
Which leads us to this massive question that every society has to wrestle with. I mean, think about it. You need a government that's strong enough to get things done. But how do you stop that same government from turning into a threat to the very people it's supposed to be serving? What's the blueprint for that?
Well, the answer, the solution thinkers at nations came up with over centuries is this idea of constitutionalism. It's the whole framework, the set of rules and beliefs, built specifically to deal with this problem of absolute unchecked power.
Okay, the key words here, the ones that change everything, are limited by. Look, any country can have a constitution written down somewhere. Even a dictatorship can have one. But constitutionalism, that's the living, breathing idea that the government is actually bound by that law. The government isn't above the law, it's created by the law and has to follow its rules.
And this quote from Louis Henkin really drives that point home. It's saying a government's power isn't a blank check, it can only do the things we've agreed it can do, for the reasons we've agreed on. It's the rule book, and even the rulers have to play by it.
And this just goes to show you there's more than one way to get there. In the US, for instance, the written constitution is seen as the ultimate source of the government's power. But in the UK, which has an unwritten constitution, those limits on government have kind of grown over time as a consequence of judges making decisions to protect people's rights. So you have different roads, but they're all heading to the same destination.
If you boil it all down, constitutionalism is really doing two main things. First, it's putting real solid limits on what the state can do. And second, by doing that, it's carving out a protected space for you and me, for our individual freedom. They're really two sides of the same coin.
Okay, so we get the why. But what about the how? How does constitutionalism actually work? What are the tools in the toolbox that make all this happen?
All right, the first and probably most fundamental tool is what we call constitutional supremacy. Just think of the Constitution as the ultimate rule book for the entire country. Every other law, every action the government takes, every decision a court makes, all of it has to follow the rules in this one document. Nobody and nothing gets to be above it.
I mean, this ruling from India's Supreme Court says it all, doesn't it? Suprema lex, the supreme law. It means every part of the government, whether it's the president, the parliament, or the courts, gets its power from the Constitution and has to stay within the lines that the Constitution draws.
Okay, tool number 2 is all about preventing too much power from ending up in one place. It's a pretty bad idea to have the same people making the laws, enforcing the laws, and then judging people based on those laws. So what do? You separate those jobs.
And here's the classic setup. You have the legislature, that's your Congress or Parliament, and their job is to make the laws. Then you have the executive, your president or prime minister, and they enforce those laws. And finally, you have the judiciary, the courts, who interpret the laws. Each one has its own turf, and, just as importantly, each one keeps an eye on the others.
The philosopher Montesquieu gave us a pretty stark warning about this centuries ago. He basically said that if you let one person or one group control all three of these powers, you're pretty much guaranteed to get a tyranny. It would be, like he said, the end of everything. That's how high the stakes are. Okay, so this brings up a pretty obvious question, right? If the Constitution is the rule book and all the parts of government are the players on the field, who's the ref? Who has the power to call a foul when one of the players steps out of line? And the answer is our third major tool, judicial review. This is the power that courts have, usually a country's highest court, to look at a new law and say, you know what, this law violates the Constitution, and because of that, it's invalid. This is the enforcement mechanism that makes the whole thing work. This idea really got cemented in the US with the famous case Marbury v. Madison. The court basically said that it's the core job of the judiciary to be the guardian of the Constitution. Without judicial review, the Constitution is just a list of nice suggestions. This is what gives it teeth. So we have all these fantastic ideas in theory, right? Supremacy, separation of powers, judicial review. But here's the reality check.
What's written on paper and what actually happens in the real world can be two very, very different things.
And this gets us right to the heart of it. A constitution is just the document. It's the set of rules. But constitutionalism, that's the actual practice. It's the culture of respecting those rules. It's the shared belief across society, from citizens to politicians to judges, that the rules matter and must be followed, even when it's inconvenient.
Let's make this real. Take a look at Sri Lanka's constitution. It actually has clauses that work against the very idea of constitutionalism. For example, Article 16 lets old laws stay on the books even if they violate basic rights. The courts can't strike down a law after it's been passed by Parliament. And some bills can be labeled urgent, giving courts as little as 24 hours to review them, which is almost no time at all.
So the big takeaway here is pretty clear. When the rules of the game can be bent or just flat out ignored whenever it's politically useful, the Constitution itself starts to lose all its power. Constitutionalism isn't just about having the right words written down. It's about whether the system can actually stand up to political pressure.
And that's really the big question I want to leave you with. Where does a constitution's real power come from? Is it in the fancy legal language written on the page? Or is it in the culture? The willingness of everyday people, of judges, of leaders, to stand up and say, no, these rules matter, and we are going to defend them. That right there is the difference between having a constitution and having constitutionalism. Thanks for watching.